Right now, somewhere in the Pacific or the Mediterranean, a U.S. aircraft carrier is cutting through dark water with almost 5,000 people living on board. Jets thunder off the flight deck, chains rattle, alarms chirp, and steel doors slam. Deep inside that floating city, a few hundred women are trying to grab a quick shower, answer a message from home, or squeeze in 4 hours of sleep. Around 4,000 of their shipmates are men. This is not a cruise ship. There are no private cabins, no balconies, and no button that says, "I'm done. I'm going home when the stress gets too much." A big U.S. carrier stands nearly 20 stories above the water and carries roughly 3,000 sailors to run the ship, plus about 1,500 people in the air wing. That is close to 5,000 sailors packed inside one steel hull for months at a time. Most deployments run 6 to 7 months, sometimes longer, with no guarantee of extra port calls if a crisis breaks out. For the women on board, every day starts with the same reality. You live where you work. Your rack, your shower, your job, your friends, and your entire chain of command all exist in the same few acres of metal. Your bedroom is one of dozens of bunks stacked 3 high in a berthing compartment that might hold 20, 30, or 40 people. The mattress is thin, the aisle is narrow, and almost everything you own for half a year has to fit in and around that rack. Sleep is a luxury, not a right. The carrier does not care what time your body thinks it is. If you work on the flight deck or in aviation maintenance, your day might start before sunrise and end long after midnight. Drills, flight operations, and sudden equipment problems can blow up any plan for a full night of rest. You learn to live on naps and the ability to fall asleep with jet engines humming above your head. Privacy gets redefined fast. Female berthings usually have a solid door and a limited number of bunks. And in some parts of the ship, there are women's bathrooms and showers. But once you step into the passageway, you are back in a world that is almost entirely mixed. Narrow hallways, steep ladders, and crowded workspaces mean you are never very far from anyone else. You change clothes behind a curtain and plan your route through the ship based on where you need to be and how quickly you can get there. The pressure isn't just emotional, it's professional. Aircraft carriers exist to launch and recover aircraft, and every sailor on board is part of that mission. A woman in the jet shop has to keep aircraft ready to launch on schedule, with no room for sloppy work. A signaler on the flight deck has to move jets into position with precise timing, inches from spinning intakes and blasting exhaust. Down in the supply spaces, somebody is tracking thousands of parts, so the air wing does not grind to a halt. The ship does not slow down to match anyone's comfort level. If you can't keep up, the mission does not wait. None of these women ended up here by accident. The U.S. Navy is an all-volunteer force. Women know before they ever step onto a carrier that they will be outnumbered, that the ship is crowded and unforgiving, and that deployments can stretch most of a year when things get busy. They sign up anyway. Today, women make up roughly 1 in 5 sailors across the Navy, and on a big deck carrier, that still means they are a clear minority. They serve in almost every job on board, from wrench-turning mechanics to pilots and department heads. Their roles are not women's billets. They are the same jobs the men fill, with the same standards and the same consequences for failure. What makes their story even more remarkable is that this world was not built with them in mind. For decades, U.S. law and Navy policy kept women off combatant ships entirely. Aircraft carriers were designed and crewed on the assumption that every person sleeping in those racks and showering in those heads would be male. The steel didn't change overnight just because policy did. So to understand how women survive and succeed living with roughly 4,000 men on an aircraft carrier, we have to go back to the moment they first walked up the gangway and stepped into a Navy that was still trying to decide if it truly wanted them there at all. When women first stepped onto an American aircraft carrier as part of the permanent crew, the ship itself hadn't changed at all. The law had. For most of the Cold War, U.S. rules simply banned women from serving on combatant ships. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers, the big gray hulls that went forward in crises, were legally off-limits. That wall didn't start to crack until the early 1990s, when Congress rolled back the combat exclusion law that kept women off warships and out of most combat aircraft. In late 1993, those restrictions were repealed, clearing the way for women to serve at sea in the same frontline platforms as men. The Navy moved quickly. On March 7, 1994, it issued the first orders assigning women to a combatant ship, the Nimitz-class carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. That fall, Ike deployed for roughly 6 months with about 350 women on board, spread across the ship's company and the embarked air wing. For the first time, a U.S. aircraft carrier went to sea with a truly mixed gender crew, instead of a handful of women in isolated billets. Medical and operational reviews afterward described the cruise as an operational success. The ship met its tasking, and flight operations stayed on track. But everyone on that ship knew they were living inside a test. The bunks, bathrooms, and workspaces had not been designed for mixed crews. They had been carved up after the fact, doors reassigned, racks rearranged, to create a small number of female berthing areas, and heads in a hull built for all men. From that point on, almost every major change to carrier life had to answer the same question. How do you make a steel city built around male crews work for everyone without breaking the ship or the mission? Some of the fixes were simple but important. Commanders and shipyard planners reallocated spaces so women could have secure berthings with nearby heads, instead of walking long distances through male spaces just to shower. They tightened access control in certain zones and made sure watch schedules and cleaning routines respected those boundaries. Over time, privacy and safety stopped being treated as extras and became part of the basic design checklist whenever a ship went in for a major refit. The newest Ford-class carriers pushed that further by building flexibility into the blueprints. On USS Gerald R. Ford, crew accommodations used smaller berthing areas and gender-neutral bathrooms nearby. The heads are built without urinals at all, relying only on stalls and seated toilets. That hardware choice makes it much easier to adjust a space for male sailors, female sailors, or a mix of both as the crew changes, without ripping out plumbing or rebuilding an entire compartment. It also means more privacy for everyone, because bathroom spaces are laid out to focus on enclosed stalls instead of open fixtures. Culture had to evolve alongside the steel. Early mixed-gender cruises were full of rumors, awkward moments, and very public scrutiny from outside the lifelines. Every relationship, every misconduct case, every pregnancy tied to those first deployments turned into headlines that followed entire crews. Leaders learned, sometimes the hard way, that you cannot just sign orders for hundreds of women and expect the climate to fix itself. You need clear standards, meaningful training, and senior enlisted personnel and officers who back those standards up even when it is uncomfortable. By the late 2010s, carriers like USS Dwight D. Eisenhower had formal women at sea programs, mentorship, and support networks, where female sailors could talk honestly about what they were facing, share practical advice, and push for changes when something was not working. These were not complaint sessions. They were survival tools, spaces where a junior sailor could ask a chief how to handle a bad comment, a tricky work dynamic, or a watch schedule that kept her walking alone at odd hours without being written off as thin-skinned. Today, when a woman checks aboard a big deck carrier, she steps into a world that still feels male-heavy, but no longer brand new. She is sleeping in berthing that was planned with women in mind, using heads that can be reassigned as the crew mix changes, and working in departments where women have already earned senior ranks. The ship is still loud, cramped, and unforgiving. But the metal around her has changed more than it looks, And the culture above the waterline is very different from what those first 350 women walked into in 1994. Even with better steel and clearer rules, life as a woman on a carrier is still a balancing act. The ship is safer and more structured than it was in the 1990s. But you are still one of a few hundred women living and working inside a steel box with thousands of men. The stress rarely explodes in one dramatic moment. It shows up in small things: a joke that lands wrong, a rumor about who is dating whom, a comment about special treatment when a watch bill is adjusted so a sailor does not have to walk alone at 2 in the morning. On a ship where you cannot leave, seeing the same faces every day for months, little problems can grow fast if leaders do not step in early. That is why the modern Navy leans so hard on prevention and command climate. With clear reporting paths, victim advocates, and commanding officers told directly that they own the culture on their ship. For most women at sea, though, the bigger story is not about the worst headlines. It is about the day-to-day work of being taken seriously. A junior aviation bosun's mate on the flight deck hooks chains to heavy jets in bad weather and moves fast under whirling rotors and blasting exhaust. Below decks, an electrician traces cables through cramped compartments to keep radar and combat systems powered. When a breaker trips or a jet needs to be moved now, nobody cares that they are women or that there are only a handful of them in their division. They care whether the work gets done safely and on time. Higher up the chain, women now run big pieces of the carrier machine. Department heads and senior chiefs manage hundreds of sailors and shape who gets trained, who gets promoted, and who gets trusted with more responsibility. Many of those leaders remember what it felt like to be the only woman in the room, and they want their junior sailors focused on qualifications, not on defending their right to be there. In 2021, Captain Amy Bauernschmidt became the first woman to take command of USS Abraham Lincoln, proving that path now runs all the way to the captain's chair. All of this matters for more than symbolism. The Navy is open about the fact that it needs talent. Women now make up close to 1/5 of the active duty sailors in the Navy, and that share is slowly rising. On a carrier, every woman who stays in, advances in rank, and takes on more responsibility helps fill critical billets in a high-tempo fleet and brings another perspective into the room when decisions are made. Right now, somewhere at sea, a woman is stepping onto the flight deck in a cranial and float coat, the deck plates vibrating under her boots as jets spool up for another launch. She is one face in a crowd of thousands, in a place that once had no room for people like her at all. She does not survive out there because the ship treats her gently. She survives because she has mastered the same brutal routine as everyone around her. And because thousands of small changes in law, design, and culture have finally started to back up that effort. These are not stories about women squeezing by on the margins of a man's navy. They are stories about sailors who happen to be women, carrying their share of the load in one of the harshest working environments on Earth. The steel city they live in is still loud, crowded, and unforgiving. But every time another woman earns her warfare pin, signs her re-enlistment papers, or walks up to the brow as the new commanding officer, the answer to one question becomes a little clearer. How do women survive with 4,000 men on an aircraft carrier? By proving, over and over again, that they are not going anywhere.